told David that we'll start at 12:10. Specifically, you eat.
Yeah, I'm here, Leo.
Oh, you're there.
Yeah, I'm going to keep my microphone muted in case there's noise here.
Okay. We'll wait for a little bit for Chen.
He's right outside. So.
Oh, just waiting for Chen. You can come in. You can still text him if they're here.
Who's he on the phone?
Much chicken. While I'm here.
Every time you're here.
Yes.
Every single meeting with much chicken.
No, I'll get tired after.
Well, I actually started the broadcast, so we're recording right now.
Oh.
Just to give you the heads up, just because there's a little lag. You kind of threw me for a loop and changed your mind.
I guess we could start. So David got his PhD from the program in Science Technology Society here at MIT. He did a postdoc at Rutgers and is currently a lecturer both at MIT and but he's a science historian. So
yeah. Hi everyone, thanks for having me. Yeah, it says Harvard Business School because the way I'm really paying my bills is by being a research associate with a professor there this year. So I have my choice of things to put at the top of the letterhead. Anyway, so yes, I'm a historian of science and kind of a historian of economic historian too. So my own research is about, just really briefly, is about the sugar economy, I guess you'd say, the kind of world of sugar production and trade and exchange in the late 19th and early 20th century, looking at slavery and empire and science and technology in the context of that, which is a really transformative kind of industrializing period for the United States and the Caribbean. I just came back from Cuba, trying to go for a long time, and so that's my own kind of field of research, and I can talk about that if you'd like. What I'm going to talk about today is as you can see, kind of MIT and science funding in the United States, and particularly the relationship between the military and industry and university, what people have called the military-industrial university complex, kind of playing a military-industrial complex in the post-war period. So let's see. All right. So, like, why study this period in particular? One way to kind of think about this is in terms of MIT, and so that's one of the kind of threads that we'll be going through what I have to say today. And there you can really see, and I think we will see, that this is really when kind of the modern MIT that we think of today was founded. MIT likes to date itself from earlier, so not too long ago there was the 150th anniversary. They just had Moving Day, right, dating it, that kind of marking this 100-year anniversary of the 1916 ceremony across the Charles, back when it was called Boston Tech in the 19th century. So, MIT goes back further than this period, but much of MIT's culture and institutions and identity derive from really what happened during World War II and right after. Another kind of aspect of this is related to the MIT one in particular, which is that the organization of kind of scientific research, large-scale scientific research in the United States, and I think in much of the world too, also turns out to have come out of not just this period in World War II, but in particular like MIT in this period in World War II. And that has had really transformative effects on the relationship between what are now called the STEM fields, right, and the humanities and the social sciences, has had effects on pedagogy and the practice of teaching in universities, teaching science in universities, and also the kind of perennial question that I think anyone who's doing any kind of research deals with, which is where the money comes from shapes or warps the priorities of the research itself. So as I said, I'm mostly a 19th, kind of early 20th century historian, focused on the United States, the Atlantic world, Caribbean, the Pacific. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of the physical sciences during and right after World War II, so a little bit, not entirely, but a little bit outside of my wheelhouse. So largely what I'm doing here is drawing on and kind of synthesizing the work of a couple of historians, a number of whom are here at MIT. There's a guy named Stuart Leslie at Hopkins, who's a sort of preeminent historian of Cold War universities. There was a guy here named David Noble in the 80s and early 90s who was a professor of the history of technology here. I think he was actually, my understanding is he was actually denied tenure for kind of what were understood to be sort of political reasons, and he wound up at York University in Toronto. But MIT made a mistake. He's a wonderful historian. Well, he passed away a few years ago. And then, most of all, David Kaiser, who's the head of the STS program, has been for 5 years. And as he reminds me every time I see him, his term is up on June 30th. He has a calendar that's like counting down, and he's really looking forward to that. He's a professor and the head of the STS program, and he's also a professor in the physics department. Let's see. So, I screwed up the order of my slides, excuse me. First I'll be talking about science in wartime, then the fight over the organization of post-war science, debates over scientific manpower, then a couple of particular cases of MIT and Vietnam, and then finally some kind of brief parallels to today. Anyway, that's Dave Kaiser has become something of a celebrity in kind of the public communication of science. So here he is with the Jizza from Wu-Tang Clan, who's become a fan of his and has met him like several times. All right. What's that?
I didn't realize that he was interested in history, science.
Yeah, I don't think anyone did, but he just sort of was around the department one day. And I mean, he's interested in, he has a program to teach chess to inner city kids, I think, too, so it's part of that. And Dave has done like a Reddit AMA. He's, he's very good at this kind of public engagement stuff. Okay, so wartime science. So really what kind of, the message to get across here is that it turns out that the structures that were developed to solve problems in research in World War II specifically were really the templates and the context for debates after the war. So I'll look at these in a couple of ways. The first is nationally, right, at a kind of national level. So research during the war was first organized through this thing called the National Defense Research Committee and then the Office of Scientific Research and Development after 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. This Office of Scientific Research and Development OSRD, was headed by Vannevar Bush, who many of you may have heard of. He was a dean of MIT, a brilliant electrical engineer who invented a mechanical differential analyzer computer, and the co-founder of Raytheon. So he was like, kind of like wealthy, well-established, and quite politically connected. Here he is on Time magazine's cover in 1944, called the General of Physics. And in the 30s, he left MIT to be the head of the Carnegie Institution in Washington. This OSRD really brought together a lot of kind of leading lights of scientific research in the United States, including the president of MIT at the time, Carl Compton, under whom Bush had worked as a dean. So during the war, unsurprisingly, military research really spooled up at a national level, or rather scientific research spooled up at a national level. By 1944, the government was spending $700 million in then dollars on research, which was 10 times what it had been spending in 1938. One criticism that was made at the time, although not so publicly, but kind of internally, was that the leaders of the OSRD, like Bush, like Compton, favored big academic institutions that they knew and that they'd come out of, and so kind of concentrated the research in those places. So of 200 universities that got research contracts that total up to $250 million, 19 universities received 2/3 of that money, and MIT was at the top of that. So now think about MIT in particular. The biggest and most famous of the kind of wartime institutions that was created at MIT was the the radiation laboratory known as the Rad Lab, which some of you may have heard of. So here's a picture of it. It was built right behind the dome on MIT's campus. I think that's Vassar Street down there. And it was built really quickly in 1941 in order to convert British microwave radar technology into a usable military device. So some British physicists had developed it, and they actually just sort of brought it to the United States. And the sort of deal between the UK and the US was that the UK would sort of completely allow the US to possess and use this technology in exchange for the resources to develop it. This is at the time, the US is not actually engaged in the war, and so the British are the ones who need the radar as quickly as they can, and the US is the one with the resources to develop it. So this Rad Lab was not an MIT lab kind of exclusively, but a multi-university collaboration. The president was from Rochester. There were physicists from Columbia, from Harvard, from I think 19 other places who were brought in. This new building was 38,000 square feet that was built in the fall of 1941. And over the course of the war, this is still a sort of staggering statistic to me, 20% of the United States' physicists worked at the Rad Lab. More were employed at the Manhattan Project, but I think that's the Manhattan Project, not just Los Alamos, but also including places like Oak Ridge, the kind of satellite but equally important centers. So this is a huge concentration of kind of intellectual capabilities and also of government funding. And in general, MIT was sort of militarized during the war. Sections of campus were closed off. Semesters were shortened to 11 weeks. A summer term was added so that students could graduate in 3 years instead of 4 years. And after Pearl Harbor, the masthead at the top of the front page of the tech student newspaper included the phrase, "Let's set the rising sun" every day in reference to the Imperial Japanese flag. Excuse me. Meanwhile, there was another model that was also developing. So the Rad Lab is the most famous, but sort of close behind it was the lab headed by a guy named Charles Stark Draper, right? Known to everybody apparently as Doc Draper. And he had produced as aircraft were getting faster, it was more and more difficult to accurately sort of target the guns on the aircraft. And so he produced a gun sight that could deal with this problem, a leading gun sight. And he collaborated with, Draper collaborated with the Sperry Gyroscope Company, this sort of long-standing nautical instrument maker, to produce this gun sight at scale. The Navy eventually bought 85,000 of these from this partnership. Sorry, there's Draper a little bit later with the ex-Nazi rocket scientist Werner von Braun. At the National Defense Research Council and the OSRC, and the Rad Lab, civilians were in charge, right? But this Draper-Sperry Navy partnership was really contractually different. It was organized differently, and MIT sort of recognized this at the time as this particular partnership as really a kind of more lucrative model for the future. Over the course of the war, MIT received almost $100 million in war contracts, which was as much as it had spent on everything for the previous 80 years of its existence. And that was kind of accelerating. So during the last year of the war, there was $40 million in money flowing through here, which was, at the time, a really extraordinary sum. But so again, the point is that the Rad Lab is sort of the most famous and will be, will continue, and we'll see it again. I'll mention it again in a few minutes. It continues to be important, but in a lot of ways, this kind of closer tie between Draper's laboratory, industry partners, and the military was seen as the model to go forward with. Okay, right. So the war ends in 1945, and before it ends, long before it ends, people like Vannevar Bush are already fighting over what the structure of post-war science is going to look like. Some of you may have seen or read or heard of this sort of famous report, Science: The Endless Frontier, which Bush submitted to the president in July of 1945 in response to a letter that FDR had written asking basically how, given all this incredible scientific progress, radar, atomic weapons, whatever else during the war, how, and the battlefield antibiotics as well, how can we keep this sort of scientific progress going, essentially, right, in the coming decades. And Bush submits this document, this report. It's about 45 pages with a number of appendices, in which he argues essentially that government funding for basic scientific research is the real articulates that government funding for basic scientific research is the foundation for endless economic progress, essentially endless economic growth, jobs for returning veterans. It's often forgotten in a way that what immediately preceded the Second World War was the Depression, right? And there was a lot of legitimate fear at the time that at the end of this, unusual wartime period, that the world would slip back into the kind of economic calamity that had beset it for the 1930s. And so what Bush is doing in that document is really laying out what he sees as the framework for continued economic growth. And he suggests, most famously, this foundation of a new permanent scientific agency devoted to funding research and training, and funding the training of new scientists. And so this document is really, you can find it on the NSF website in a very prominent place. This is really taken as the kind of like founding charter, kind of somewhere between a constitution and a Declaration of Independence for the NSF. But crucially, one of the things that Bush argues here is that this new agency should be almost completely independent from outside control. It should be funded, but not controlled in any way by the other institutions of the United States government. So Bush says this new agency should recognize, and the government should recognize, that freedom of inquiry must be preserved, so I'm quoting here, and should leave internal control of policy, personnel, and the method and scope of research to the institutions in which it's carried on. And he suggested that this research, as he called it, the National Research Foundation, should be given huge amounts of power to do things like amend contracts, ignore kind of federal auditing rules. So really a lot of autonomy granted to these scientists. So as I said, this is really taken as a kind of founding document, but it's often forgotten that there were alternative proposals. And so I want to talk about one of those for a minute. Not everybody was so, the scientists, particularly at the Rad Lab, places like MIT, Caltech, Columbia, Harvard, were quite happy in general to get all of this military wartime funding. It was a lot of money. They didn't really need to concern about cost. They could, no one needed to concern themselves with how much some new instrument cost. And universe had really kind of grown fat on this. And physicists in particular were not particularly keen to give it up. I mentioned earlier that I would say something about the kind of false attribution of credit. And part of the reason that physicists will get so much credit and so much funding after World War II, which I'll say more about in a minute, is that they were really credited between radar and the atomic weapons with having sort of won the war. But actually, if you read into the kind of the history of the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos, the fission is the physics part. The nuclear physics part is like not the hard part. The hard part is shaping the explosives in a way and engineering the devices in such a way that they can take advantage of this sort of relatively straightforward kind of atomic physics. So the real heroes of Los Alamos, if you consider them heroes, were the chemists who had done this. But all that was classified, right? Like even whatever, obviously the physics in some sense was classified, in lots of sense was classified too. But it was the chemists' work that was really kept secret. And so the chemists were the ones, in a sense, who should have gotten the credit, but they couldn't because the physicists were the ones sort of trumpeting themselves. I hope there's no physicists in this room who are just offended too badly anyway. So people like Vannevar Bush, again, didn't mind these military grants so much as long as they allowed scientists to more or less direct their own research. But whenever anyone suggested there should be congressional oversight, they would turn around and argue that actually pure science shouldn't be directed by anyone except for the scientists themselves. So they really wanted to, as I said, keep this party going. And so actually before this document, in 1945, in I think 1943, people like MIT's president, as I said, Carl Compton, the president of GE, the former head of Bell Labs, and others advocated a plan for what they called a research board for national security, which would basically take huge block grants to the military and administer it under scientists. And historians, as I mentioned, David Noble, have argued that really this kind of refusal, rejection of the democratic sort of controls that are small d democratic, that are assigned to every other function of the U.S. government, aligned with a lot of these scientists, especially the kind of senior scientists, political conservatism, their affiliation with big business, as in the case of, say, Bell Labs or GE, and sort of belief in laissez-faire, unfettered markets. And so this board, this research board, was actually established in 1944 by the order of the Secretary of War. It was going to be sort of under the National Academy of Sciences and funded by the Carnegie Institution, which, as I said, Bush is the president of. But FDR killed it in short order. And part of the reason he did that was because of the opposition of other members of FDR's sort of New Deal coalition, right? So one of them, in particular, was this a Democratic senator from West Virginia named Harley Kilgore, and he wanted and had wanted for most of the war tighter federal oversight over the scientific expenditures. More in the post-war period, he wanted more directed research away from defense and towards things like energy, water, manufacturing technologies, and other sorts of non-military issues. And he also wanted scientists to sort of share control over science. He also objected to a policy that the Office of Research and Development had more or less continued throughout the war. In 90% of cases, they had given away the patent rights to innovations funded by government money to whatever private institutions were doing the research. And earlier in the war, Senator Kilgore had tried to establish a different sort of setup for scientific research, the Office of Science and Technology Mobilization, which would, in his, as he saw it, sort of protect research from being co-opted by any particular, as he put it, a monopoly, right, including not just business, but also kind of a cohort of these elite scientists themselves. As I said, FDR killed this sort of military scientific research board. His budget director, in particular, was one of the voices behind killing it, and spoke out against I'm quoting here again, the assumption that researchers are as temperamental as a bunch of musicians, and that consequently we must violate most of the tenets of democracy and good organization to adjust for their lack of emotional balance. So again, you can see that these are real fighting words. So Kilgore, as I said, Senator Kilgore's plan for the post-war was what he called a National Science Foundation, as against Bush's National Research Foundation. And this would be, rather than in Bush's view, it would be headed. There would be a presidentially appointed board of scientists, but the scientists would sort of run their own ship. Kilgore wanted a presidentially appointed director and a board that included not only scientists, but also, and not only scientists and business executives, but also representatives of small business, consumers, and labor organizations, and retaining a kind of public ownership over this. The sort of elite cadre of scientists were not happy. Harvard's president, James Bryan Conant, who helped direct the Manhattan Project, called this dictatorial. The president of Bell Labs said it would make scientists into, quote, slaves of the state. So fighting words on both sides. FDR, passed away in April of 1945. His successor, Harry Truman, was an ally of Kilgore's and endorsed Kilgore's bill, vetoed Bush's kind of more scientifically controlled one when it came to his desk. And it was only actually 5 years after the end of the war in 1950, during the Korean War, that a compromise bill passed, which basically was almost a complete. It's very close to what Bush had originally envisioned. So the point of all this is just to say that the kind of origins of the modern federal funding for basic science were really, as historians like to say, sort of contested and up for debate at the time. And there were alternatives, alternatives that involve more public oversight over the direction of research. Okay, so, oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. That was the various members of this Office of Scientific Research and Development with the wrong caption superimposed on it. Sorry about that. Okay. So now I'd like to talk about the sort of post-war changes in American science, and particularly the idea of scientists as kind of like Cold War manpower. So the first place to talk about this is again at MIT. So MIT really had difficulty grappling with this enormous wartime and then post-war expansion, and came to be called, in some circles, a Pentagon on the Charles. A couple of years after the end of the war, obviously government research contracts had fallen by 3/4, but even that seemed too large to a lot of people at the time. And then during the Korean conflict, again, the national security research apparatus sort of spooled up and grew 36% in the first year of the war, 31% in the next year. Unlike after the Second World War, it continued to grow. So it doubled every 6 years until 1968, and by which point sponsored research, mostly from the government, accounted for 80% of MIT's budget. So the two biggest organizations by far were the Research Laboratory of Electronics and the Instrumentation Laboratory. So the Laboratory of Electronics came out of the RAD lab that I mentioned earlier that had developed radar and spawned eventually what we now think of as we now know as the Lincoln Lab in the early 1950s. And this was basically designed as a place where MIT students and faculty could conduct big classified research projects. I remember learning early on when I got to MIT that I was sort of fascinated by the idea that people did classified dissertations. And I kind of wanted my dissertation to be classified just because it seemed cool, but unsurprisingly, they don't allow that. And partly as a result of these sorts of stories. So these were sort of controversial and uneasy additions to MIT from the beginning. And mostly what Lincoln Labs did was work on sort of bomber defense and then missile defense. It's on an Air Force base out of Lexington. The Instrumentation Laboratory, built out of the lab that Charles Draper had started and moved on from gun sights to mostly work on missile guidance. And here's a kind of recruiting advertisement for MIT graduates to work at the Instrumentation Lab. And that was just around the corner in Cambridge, in Kendall Square. It got to the point, these kind of labs grew to the point where in 1962, the director of Oak Ridge National Laboratory said that it was, quote, hard to tell whether MIT is a university with many government research laboratories attached to it or a cluster of government research laboratories with a very good educational institution appended to it. So again, the mission of an educational institution in the Cold War is really being threatened by by the influx of military, kind of broadly directed military funding. Sorry, just a moment. So this expansion, MIT again is sort of leading the way with what the post-war Cold War university is going to look like. But this was something that was happening nationally as well. Physicists in particular, scientists in general, as a result of Bush's sort of work, but physicists in particular were physics, as a discipline, universities were under pressure to produce more physicists than ever before at increasing rates. Much like the famous so-called missile gap between the U.S. and Soviet nuclear arsenals that turned out not to exist and not to matter if it did exist. The fear was that the Soviet Union was producing researchers in extraordinary numbers, and successes like Sputnik helped with that sort of perception. And so physicists in particular, but scientists in general, were routinely described as tools of war, as major war assets that could be stockpiled and rationed and distributed. So provisioning physicists was like provisioning tanks or airplanes. So as a result, and of the Cold War school up in military funding, billions of dollars was funneled into graduate education, facilitated also by the GI Bill, right, which supported veterans going to universities for the first time. You can see here, this is a chart that, again, Dave Kaiser put together that shows that physics sort of took off at this much higher rate than all PhDs expanded. The number of PhDs expanded quite substantially, but the number of physics PhDs expanded at the greatest rate of all. And then, as you can see, also it collapsed much harder than anyone else. I'll mention that again. At MIT in particular, this expansion that you can see here really raised fundamental questions about the curriculum. In 1900, which is not on this chart, grad students had composed just 0.4% of MIT's student body. In 1930, they were 17%, and by the late 1960s, they were 50%. And an MIT sort of blue ribbon sort of panel like MIT likes to establish when it has problem to deal with. Founded in the late 1940s, considered radical proposals like, on the one hand, abolishing undergraduate education entirely and just turning MIT into a totally graduate research university. Alternatively, to expanding undergraduate curricula to 5 or 6 years to sort of encompass everything that the modern scientist or engineer needed to know. They also suggested, and this is where I come from, that this, quote, new kind of engineer needed to be humanized, their words, because technologies, again, like radar and especially like nuclear weapons, had really showed how clearly the social and the political were connected to the technical issues, right? It was impossible to separate them. So a sort of new humanities kind of component to the curriculum was supposed to civilize MIT graduates, and that again is the words of this commission, but also cure MIT graduates of the feeling of inferiority that they supposedly had compared to other schools, which seems sort of hilarious today, but was widely believed to be the case in the 1940s and 1950s. And so the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, where I again come from, was the result. But unfortunately, but perhaps predictably, that became just another venue for Cold War research. So the Center for International Studies, which funded my research in the Caribbean at some point, was funded initially by the CIA, surprise, surprise. And political scientists and other members of the school did psychological warfare and propaganda research for the State Department. So again, not the most sort of glorious, story. And more broadly, what again Dave Kaiser has called the Cold War bubble in American physics. And he makes a strong argument that you can think about what happened to physics in the same way as what happened to housing or dot-com stocks in the 90s was really taking place. And physics, as I said, was sort of the bellwether for American higher education, the most important in the Cold War because it had won the Second World War. And this had really, this explosion of graduate training in particular, but undergraduate as well, really had substantial effects not just on the number of physics PhDs who were being produced, but how they would be trained and also what kind of subjects would be concentrated on in the field of physics as a whole. So class sizes and student to faculty ratios unsurprisingly expanded when you have this kind of growth. And one way to see this is by looking at something like quantum mechanics. So before the war, quantum mechanics was generally taught to small numbers of graduate students in small seminars that emphasized wrestling with the sort of philosophical implications and apparent paradoxes that confront anybody who tries to understand what's going on in an introductory course. So quantum mechanics textbooks would cite people like Plato and Kant and Kierkegaard, which seems unfathomable today, and qualifying exams for graduate students often called for sort of essays on these philosophical matters. But following World War II, places like the Rad Lab and Draper's Laboratory at MIT, this was sort of transformed into a physics culture that emphasized pragmatism, what people sort of derided as gadgets, right? What mattered was what worked, and oftentimes practice, advanced much faster than any kind of theory did. And after the war, this kind of growth led to the abandonment of seminars in favor of lectures, and as a result, the abandonment of sort of philosophical problems in favor of a mentality of shut up and calculate, right? This is both because those sorts of techniques were perceived as more necessary for making military gizmos, but also because it's just impossible to teach 100 students kind of deep, complicated philosophy subjects in the way that you can do it with 10 students, right? It doesn't scale in the same way. Not everybody was so happy with this, and here I'm strongly going to recommend Dave Kaiser's recent book, How the Hippies Saved Physics, Science, Counterculture, and the Quantum Revival, which is great. There were still some people who, as I said, were not thrilled with this, and there was in particular, a small group of sort of philosophically minded outsiders, not people in tenure track jobs, not people in research positions, but they were physics PhDs who had kind of like weird meandering careers, and were deeply involved in all sorts of everything you would expect from the 60s is in this book. All sorts of counterculture, drugs, extrasensory perception, kind of meditation retreats in Big Sur in California. But it actually turns out that as a result of sort of decades of wrestling with these philosophical problems, the work that this small group called the Fundamental Physics Group, physics spelled F-Y-S-I-K-S, the work that this group wound up doing became incredibly important to, has now led to quantum computing, essentially. And then, but as you can see in that chart from earlier, in the late 60s, early 70s, during Vietnam, the U.S. government's, sort of pulled back from this broad science funding after 2 decades of sort of throwing money at scientific research. And so the market for physics PhDs collapsed. So in the mid-60s, there were more people looking to hire new PhDs than there were graduates. But in 1971, there were over 1,000 applicants for just 53 jobs. Okay, so the last thing I'd like to talk about is, really last thing I'd like to talk about is MIT and Vietnam, in the Vietnam era. So at MIT, there were all sorts of protests at Harvard, at Yale, at Columbia. People took over the campuses. Didn't quite happen here. At MIT, people protested, mostly focusing on the instrumentation lab, right, over in Kendall, and Lincoln Labs over in Lexington. The defenders of these places insisted they were kind of unique opportunities for real-world research, right? Incredibly practical place to apply MIT skills and training. Opponents, as I mentioned, said they were too militarized and also too far from kind of direct MIT supervision, and just in general objected to this common practice of having graduate students work on classified problems. They were also enormous. So each of them individually spent as much of the rest of MIT's sponsored research put together, and together they made up over half of MIT's entire budget. And they made MIT the only university among the 100 biggest military contractors in the 60s, at 54th in like 1968 or 69. This was part of a sort of debate over whether to be, and a general debate that you can see happening over and over again about whether it's better to be, as the saying goes, on the inside pissing out or the outside pissing in. Pardon my language. Some people, like the founder of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener here, refused to do any military work after 1946. Others, like the guy with the pipe here, who was the future MIT president, Jerry Wiesner, had been JFK's science advisor and told protesters that he had, quote, done more for peace than you ever had by being involved in the making of policy. So this photo was taken on March 4th, 1969, which is a day that an organization calling itself the Science Action Coordinating Committee at MIT of students and faculty had declared it a day of reflection, which the press obviously called a strike. 1,400 students, most of the students stayed in their offices and in their labs, but 1,400 out of 7,700 crammed into Kresge Auditorium to hear panel discussions and other speakers talk about kind of war-related issues. This organization, by the way, the coordinating committee, eventually assumed a more permanent form as the Union of Concerned Scientists, right, which still exists and still does important research and advocacy on food, sustainability, environmental questions, and a lot of nuclear weapons research, nuclear weapons issues research too. So protesters in this period marched from, they assembled at Building 10 a number of times and marched to Draper Labs, where Draper himself sort of confronted them. Lincoln Labs obviously was harder to get to, both because it was in Lexington well, I guess there's a history of marching to Lexington from Boston, and it was also very conveniently located inside a protected Air Force base. There were other things going on at the same time at MIT. A little bit after this, the president of the MIT Undergraduate Association, a guy named Mike Albert, who was also an active anti-war protester, was actually expelled, mostly for his political activity, as a result of which a bunch of students used a battering ram and broke down the door of the president's office. So once again, MIT forms a commission, as it likes to do, under the dean of the Sloan School, which is tasked with sort of finding a solution to what to do with these laboratories. Among other people on this, probably the most famous person on this panel now is Noam Chomsky. This is a pretty slick-looking picture of him from 1969. What's that?
He was young once.
He was young once, exactly. I know, I saw this picture, I was like, can this really be Noam Chomsky? He doesn't really... Yeah, it's true. And so the question was, should MIT sort of embrace these labs more closely and try to supervise them more? Should it divest itself of them entirely, or should it convert them to more civilian research? And there were labs at MIT that had a lot of military funding that had sort of acquired more civilian sponsors. So eventually this panel, to Chomsky's disappointment, recommended sort of better integration and more direct oversight over this military research. Chomsky was in favor of converting them to more civilian problems. Draper himself, who was still the head of the instrumentation laboratory, 25 years after starting it, was basically fired as the head of the laboratory. And this new oversight panel sort of spent a year looking over the activities of Lincoln Labs and the instrumentation lab, and decided that the more permanent solution would be to divest MIT of this instrumentation lab at Kendall and retain the Lincoln Labs in Lexington, partly because being in Lexington would remain out of sight, out of mind. That was Draper's argument, who accused the Institute of making his laboratory a scapegoat since it was so close and so visible. And we know what happened to the instrumentation lab, right? It became this nonprofit corporation, named after Draper Labs, and I tried to get a good picture of their logo, but I couldn't find it, which is basically, I don't know if you must have seen it walking on Broadway or Main Street, but it's almost like a comical kind of Bond villain corporation logo, right? It's like a big target bullseye. And after the divestment from MIT, it became just what people had warned. It became even more dependent on close ties to the military and military research. And it also happened that this didn't do much to sort of dent MIT's affiliation with military science either. Even if you exclude the instrumentation laboratory and the Lincoln laboratory, in the 1970s, MIT remained the biggest university defense contractor. And these issues of classified research sort of remained pertinent for a couple of decades. So in the 1980s, everybody from students to the president objected to research on Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, more commonly known as Star Wars, lasers to blow ballistic missiles out of the sky. Didn't work. And the majority, including the president in his commencement address in 1985, opposed classified research, again, for graduate students and security clearances. But Draper now and Lincoln still have maintained their ties to MIT, though as people like Chomsky were afraid they would now be out of direct campus oversight. And after 9/11, actually, it turns out another sort of MIT, esteemed panel actually recommended them bring them closer again, bringing these laboratories closer again, in order to provide facilities for kind of terrorism-related classified research. Once again. So I've taken up a lot of your time. I just want to sort of wrap this all together with what I hope will be, a couple of, I'm sure they've occurred to you already, but a couple of parallels that seems to me exist to contemporary issues facing MIT. One is a sort of growth and expansion, right? I mean, the MIT sort of 2030 plan, and that's just on campus, right? All sorts of new structures and new institutes have been built even since I've been kind of bumming around this campus for 7 or 8 years at this point, right? When I got here, the new neuroscience building had just been built, and since then, all sorts of new facilities, well-endowed institutions with all sorts of outside funding have been erected. And And that's not even counting or thinking about the Novartis sort of research facility. There's also, more generally, right, outside of MIT, some debates and sort of discussion and consideration of what the relationship between universities and industry should be. There was the, I'm sure most of the people in this room know this story better than I do, but Uber basically bought Carnegie Mellon's computer science department or robotics department, right? There's also, obviously, most pertinently perhaps, to the last story I told, the question of divestment, right? Which a lot of my students, when I taught at MIT in the fall, were very sort of passionately engaged and involved in. And once again, MIT established a commission and then didn't exactly like what it heard. So this is the clearest, but again, I think there are a number of parallels we can see to sort of contemporary issues facing MIT and universities more generally. So I have told all these sort of stories today, sorry about this, not to venerate MIT's like founding fathers, but these were flawed human beings to say the least. And it's not also to say that like the past will predict the future, right? That what happened to laboratories in the past, what happened to MIT after World War II is going to happen, as a result of the kind of expansion now. But nonetheless, I hope that, and it seems to me worthwhile to study these sorts of instances in, as we were talking about earlier, the kind of broader history of science and the history of kind of academic science and institutions like MIT, to see how an institution like scientific research in the United States or like MIT itself can react. So there are lessons to learn from history, I would hope. All right. Thank you very much. It's good. It's good argument.
Questions?
So I'm not sure I followed. When you said they kind of divested
Draper, yes.
Do you think that was a good thing or a bad thing? It sounded like you thought that was a bad thing because they had less academic oversight.
Well,
I mean, it's not that simple, but
yeah, I don't know whether it's a good thing. I was trying to sort of channel what people were saying at the time, I guess. I mean, it depends what your goal is, right? And it depends how much you value, say, like the purity of pure science in a university, sort of your own institution's purity versus sort of social, more or like kind of society level issues, right? So in this Vietnam era dispute, much as with the divestment debate over fossil fuels earlier this academic year, people said the problem isn't like converting, Draper Lab's research priorities or Draper Lab or the kind of institute's priorities. The problem is converting like society as a whole, right? So the argument against divesting MIT from sort of fossil fuels, and one of them was like the endowment's not big enough to make a difference. It's not really going to do anything. It's just going to sort of lose MIT whatever kind of seat at the table it has. And similarly, people said, well, you can convert Draper to civilian research, but it turned out that converting laboratories, an enormous laboratory like that, replacing military funding with civilian sort of non-military oriented, non-defense oriented funding was not easy, right? So I'm not sure whether I think it was a good idea or a bad idea. That's a very historian answer. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, let me do one.
Yeah.
About what happened after the Second World War was not just conflicts in Korea and the Cold War, which in a way wasn't a war, but also a permanent state of integrating these military industrial conflicts and these theories that it was sustained only because of the Cold War. That it was sustained only because the Cold War caused the permanent performance.
Which was sustained?
The military industrial conflict.
Yeah.
you know the theory behind Cold War? It's not the theory behind the Cold War, but you know the fact, Cold War strategy for research here? Or was that mostly at Stanford and other places?
No, I think my understanding is that they were that kind of work was carried out here. I'm not exactly sure where kind of like nuclear, the sort of macabre nuclear game theory kind of work was done. But I mentioned very briefly these sort of projects in the social sciences here, right, about psychological warfare and propaganda, things like that. So they were, MIT was not aloof from that either. I don't know the specifics of that enough, but if you're interested, I do know the works you can look up, or I can look up to get you an answer.
It seems to me, again, just as an outsider's view, that the business influence, the private sector influence on research and MIT, seems like that's eclipsing.
Yeah.
Is there, I guess, that's like maybe part two of the story, or like that kind of came online?
Yeah. So.
I guess how that fits in with the government.
Yeah. Well, I think so. I didn't really mention this, but like in the 20s, teens and 20s and 30s, MIT had this was operating under this thing called the technology plan, which basically called for like better integration with like local Cambridge industries, right? The kind of factories that have now all been converted to biotech, Google offices. And then that was, during and after the Second World War, government funding just got so much larger, right, than private funding. But I suspect if you look at it over the last, since the end of the Cold War, right, that the amount of money available from sort of private research has gotten so much larger than government research. And also, I think it moves. It sort of moves faster and is more kind of flexible in a way. So as I was sort of going through this material to put this together, I had to sort of remind myself that we think of like the Defense Department as this like incredibly sort of like clunky, ungainly bureaucratic institution, right? But in 1945, it was sort of like the peak of organizational sophistication. Right, and it had taken everything that we now think of, all the kind of management techniques of, kind of modern corporations, and incorporated them into its own sort of structure. So these government institutions were the most nimble, the best resourced. They were bureaucratic, but that wasn't necessarily seen until the 50s and 60s as being a real downside. Whereas now, I imagine that private funding, corporate funding, moves much more quickly than government funding does. So I suspect that has some also element of the attraction that universities have to it. But I'm just sort of shooting from the hip.
Somewhat related to that question, what can we learn from there was a sort of physicist hub in some sense. Right now there seems to be maybe like a computer science or a data scientist bubble. What can we learn from that, I guess?
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's just the lesson of every bubble is sort of just to be like, you hope to be able to see it happening, but of course nobody, if you could see it happening, well, I'm trying to figure out how to put this. I guess the lesson is just sort of not to assume that, go back to that, there's that slide. Not to assume that like the gravy train is going to be lasting forever. It's kind of a weird metaphor, but you know what I mean, right? So people are sort of constantly predicting that the sort of Silicon Valley economy is going to start to slow down, and every time it seems there's some economic or statistical indicator that seems like it might indicate that, right? Everybody sort of jumps on, lots of media sort of jump on that and say, aha, here it is, right? So it's always hard to sort of spot the bubble right there,
Why did it fall
Because well, partly it was because there was, it turns out, not an unlimited supply of things, unlimited demand for things you can do with physicists, right? So the private sector, a lot of the physicists who were trained under the government grants went to work for places like Raytheon and defense contractors, and other defense contractors. Excuse me. But it is correlated in 1970 with the passage of legislation that sort of ended these really kind of broad spectrum government grants that or defense-related grants for basic scientific research. And after that, defense funding had to focus on deliverable sorts of projects. So that probably has something to do with it. For a longer answer, Dave will have to finally write this book that he's been threatening to write for almost 10 years now about American physics in this Cold War bubble. But my sense is that's why that it had something to do with that, the abandonment of funding and the kind of saturation of the market.
Food.
Food.
We have small plates here. Keep you on a diet.
Wasn't super satisfactory answer.
No,
but
it's the thing that interests me most from a health perspective.
Sorry, should I close it out, or are we?
David Stone, do you have any questions?
No, thanks for your presentation. You'll notice when you get to Charlottesville, there's the physics building, there's the Beams building.
Uh-huh.
It's not physics Beams, it's Jesse Beams, who is a grad student at Yale with Ernest Lawrence.
Uh-huh.
He was also involved in this stuff. Obviously, the scale was nothing like MIT. But anyway, Leo has my email if I can help you with any questions, about life here.
Yeah, sure, thank you.
Let me know. So, thank you very much.
No, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dave. We'll see you in Charlotte next week.
Okay, I'll talk to you next week, Leo.
Yes. Bye.